Okay, before we even get started reassembling our engine, it's extremely important, and I cannot stress this enough, to have all of your correct reference material at hand. I would highly recommend that you go through all your manuals and make sure that you brush up on the requirements for building that specific motor. On this particular one, I used 3 different manuals. Not only do you want to read ahead and make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into, I would recommend doing this before you order parts, because if you order the wrong parts, then you're stuck with parts and you're trying to resell them. Sometimes it takes months in order to get ready to rebuild an engine. So you might not be able to return those parts if you order the wrong ones. So anyways, read up, get your parts, and then you always want to make sure that you have the correct type of tooling. So, you're going to need a lot of precision instruments in order to rebuild a motor, take, fine readings and whatnot. So just make sure that you're tooled up and ready for the job, and the first tool you need is knowledge. All right, let's get started.
Using some oil on a clean rag, I'm going to go ahead and wipe down all the machine surfaces on this engine block. Not only does it protect them, but we also got to clean out any kind of grit or anything that we might have left in there from the machine shop. Gonna remove these bearing caps. This one's always fun. Get a little pry action here. Pop that sucker loose. Using some compressed air, just blowing out all of the oil journals and lines and water lines. You don't know what could be left in there after it got hot tanked and magnafluxed and machined. Get some fresh bearings in there. Look at those guys. So this right here is the thrust bearing, goes in the middle. It's a bit of a tight fit. Okay, and then we're just going to go ahead and wipe everything down, make sure there's no grit, and apply some assembly lube. Can never use too much. Make sure you get the thrust bearing faces. And install the old crankshaft. Okay, now we're just going to install the rest of our bearings and the bearing caps. And then apply a generous coating of assembly lube. And then get these suckers torqued down. Make sure the arrows are pointing forward. Let me just glob some of this on there. Get it glob a little bit more. Spread it around. Thrust bearing faces. Gotta glob it. So here I'm using a brass drift to kind of drive these into their final resting place. Every single time I get one seated, I rotate the crankshaft and make sure that there's no binding or sticking. If something is cockeyed or, not straight, then you can feel it. So this is our rear main seal. I've been instructed, per one of the instructions, to install it at this juncture. It seems a little bit odd to me, but I'm going to give it a whirl. I'm going to go ahead and use a brass O-ring pick to get this sucker seated. Make yourself scarce. Foreman's making a pass through. Okay, now that the coast is clear, we're going to go ahead and drive in our vertical seals in the rear main bearing. But first we're going to put some sealant up here in the corners to aid in the sealing of the rear main bearing. We're also going to apply some of the sealant inside of the grooves where these strips are going. Alright, so these sealing strips just get plopped right into the grooves on the rear main bearing. I'm going to apply a generous coating of assembly lube. And then drive this sucker back home. Now this is a machine fit, so everything's got a nice tight fit. Gonna have to tap it in with the brass drift. There we go. And I lost the footage where I put in those little metal shims behind these sealing strips. But rotates great, ready to torque down these main bearing caps. So before I start doing my initial round of torque, I'm going to thrust it forward towards the thrust bearing. So you want to thrust your crankshaft by prying against the engine block, not one of the bearing caps. Otherwise you'll just screw everything up and you'll be redoing this. Don't look at my slippers. Everybody's got garage slippers. Mine are normal. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and finish torquing all these up in the recommended torque pattern and remove my little handy dandy screw here that I used to pop that loose, and then flip the block back around because we are ready to assemble some more parts. So we're going to check our ring gap. You know, I highly recommend doing this before assembling the engine. If you don't have an adequate ring gap, then there's nowhere for the ring to expand to once it gets hot, and you can break a ring, blow the cap off your piston, or score your cylinder walls, and you'll be redoing this job in no time. So using one of the new pistons to seat the rings in evenly, I'm just going to go ahead and measure the gap and then grind them as necessary to achieve a satisfactory gap. After you get done gapping all of your piston rings and keeping track of which piston rings go to what cylinders, we're ready to assemble our pistons. So I'm just going to chuck this up in the vise, do it very loose. You're not looking to crush it or damage it. You just need something to hold it. And there we go. So I'm going to start basically building it from the bottom up. Put the little wiper seals in here, and then the oil ring, and then another wiper seal, then the bottom piston ring, and then the upper piston ring. As I'm doing this, I am indexing the gap in each one of the rings per the factory service manual or the manufacturer's suggestion. Here's the secondary piston ring. It has a little dimple next to the gap or the split in the ring, and that is what indicates the top side of that ring, but it is the lower ring. And then here is the number 1 piston ring or top piston ring. That one does not have a dimple next to the gap. That's F for forward. And now it's time to stick our little bearings inside of our connecting rods. Make sure your oil port in your bearing matches the oil port on the connecting rod or the bearing cap, whatever your setup is. And you press it in. You got that little tab there going into the groove. Oil hole lines up. Everything is good. I'm going to put these little protectors on my studs so I don't score the crankshaft as I'm driving this down into the engine block. Now, this isn't 100% necessary in some applications, and plenty of people would be welcome to argue this, but I do submerge my pistons in oil, and then I let it drain out. I wipe the top off, and then I install it. Some say it's not necessary. I'm just doing it as a precaution. Alright, so with my quality assurance inspector, I'm going to go ahead and install these pistons. I'm going to have to give it a little tap. And there we go. Inspector's happy. I'm happy. Pistons installed. Push that down towards the crankshaft. And then just for showing you, I'm going to go ahead and flip it back around and install the bearing cap, as well as do a pinch check using some plastic gauge. I've already mic'd out all these journals, did inside and outside dimensions, and did diametrical clearances. But just to show you guys, I'm going to go ahead and crush some of this plastic gauge. So installing it just offset because there is an oil port on the bearing cap. or on the connecting rod cap, and I don't want that messing up my reading, so I'm putting it just off center line. Making sure that the stamp markings and the direction of your cap is important. And we're just going to install this. Make sure everything is as seated as you can get by hand, and then you want to bring it to full torque. And once you're done torquing it up, go ahead and break that sucker loose, and look at that, nice and squished. So using the meter on the side of the plastic gauge, we're going to compare that to the plastic gauge itself. So this one is within tolerance. It's 1.5 thousandths of an inch. So after you clean that off, I'm going to go ahead and do a final install on this cap, and then finish putting in the rest of the pistons and doing the same thing on all 5 other cylinders. Alright, now that we got all of our pistons installed, we're going to go ahead and put in our oil mist screen for the crankcase ventilation system. Just get stuffed all the way down in there. And then we're going to go ahead and put our little shield in here. It retains that packing. Just held in by a couple of little screws. I'm using a magnet to hold the screw in place while I get the starter thread indexed in there. Get that sucker screwed in. And flip her around. Look at that thing of beauty. So protecting my machine surfaces, I'm going to go ahead and use a dial indicator to find top dead center on the number 1 piston. Go nice and easy. When it starts backing back down, you know that you reached your maximum. So I'm just going to return it back there. I'm going to go ahead and put my little alignment dowels in for the cylinder head. Just tap these in gentle. I know some of you guys are probably cringing right now. Alright, it's time to check out fitment of our new head gasket. Uh-oh. Some of those holes don't line up very good. Can't say I'm a fan of that. So I'm going to go ahead and mark it with a red Sharpie and bust the old Dremel out, and I'm going to kind of oblong these holes a little bit. Some of you might argue that it's not important and I'm wasting my time. But some of you might say, hey, that's a good idea. So I'm going to go ahead and do it. I'm being very cautious, you know, make sure that the bit doesn't walk away from me and, you know, score the face of the gasket, because you don't want to, you know, generate a leak path. That would just be terrible. Using an X-Acto knife and getting in there like a surgeon, just taking any frays off. Don't want any frays breaking loose while the engine's running and passing through your oil system. That would be terrible. Alright, checking fitment again. And look at that. I mean, might not be perfect on all the holes, but it looks a heck of a lot better. No obstructions. So in preparation for final assembly of the cylinder head, I'm going to wipe everything down, make sure it's all clean, install my modified head gasket. I'm going to go ahead and wipe down all the machine surfaces on the cylinder head. Make sure there's no lapping compound. I'll also use compressed air to blow everything out. Verifying that my cam is lining up with the timing mark. I'm using my old cam gear, and I don't know if you can see that line that's on that thrust plate. It's right there. That's the line. And there is a notch on the back of the gear that I was lining up to that. So carefully, I'm going to install the cylinder head. Alright, so I'm installing ARP studs, and I'm following the manufacturer's recommended installation instructions, which is hand tight, using just engine oil as a lubricant. So I am going to put just a tiny amount of torque just to seat them in there, not going too crazy, and slap these washers in there. And once you get the washers in, we're going to put in our 12-point ARP nuts. They're weird looking. Need a 12-point socket to torque them down. So I'm just going to seat all of these evenly using a low torque impact wrench. And then I'm torquing these down using the ARP manufacturer's recommendations. So I went through the factory service manual, I went through my how to modify a Datsun manual, and just made sure that everything was within the ballpark. So here's our timing sprocket for the crankshaft. The bevel goes towards the motor. Just going to use a brass rod to kind of tap that into place. And here's our timing chain. Note the bright colored links on it. You have two. One for the crankshaft gear and one for the camshaft gear. Just going to make sure all this is indexed in there. You want that bright link to line up with that dimple that's on the side of the sprocket, just like so. Alright, so that's installed. Okay, well, we're going to have to put in our timing chain tensioner so we don't end up accidentally skipping a link. But first I'm going to just lightly install the camshaft sprocket. And we'll get to torquing that later. Alright, here's our guide strips. So on this particular motor, the guide strips do have a entry and departure angle requirement for the timing chain. You want to make sure that the timing chain is entering that skid plate and leaving the skid plate without really hacking into the leading edge or trailing edge. Alright, and we're just going to go ahead and lubricate this with some engine oil. Nice and lubed. And then install. Fortunately, this one doesn't really have any kind of requirements. It just bolts straight in. Alright, getting this sucker torqued. Alright, now here's that departure angle that we talked about. I know it's kind of difficult for you guys to see. And torquing this sucker up. So this little torque wrench I'm using is called a Bike Master. It does inch-pounds and foot-pounds, but it's a low-range torque. Okay, we're going to get our timing chain tensioner put together. Now I got my gasket, the timing chain tensioner housing, and the spring. Get it all into one tidy package before installing it. Now excuse my mouth breathing as I try to get this thing installed without it flying apart in several pieces across the garage. And that sucker is getting torqued. Okay, now that's the sprocket for the oil pump slash distributor. And I think this is going to do it for the first part. You know, be sure to tune in for the next part where we finish the engine build and get it ready for install. You know, I'd like to, thank you guys personally for watching this long, and I hope to see you again. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll get back to it in the next video.